Hey guys, so welcome to another hands-on video. Now in this video, we are going to learn how to invoke a step function privately. So let's get started. So let's say that we have a step function. So this could be a express step function or a standard step function. And we have some steps in it. And for this example, let's say that I have a Lambda function. And this Lambda function is calling out to a different services, so on and so forth. And then stops it. So we have a step function and now we want to invoke it. So usually when we are invoking a step function, we will be invoking it over public internet. So if you use AWS SDK, invoke step function method or start a step function method, so that will usually go over the internet and then invoke it. But for security reasons, we wanted to invoke it privately, so we don't have to go over the internet, and then these requests are not vulnerable to internet vulnerabilities. So in this case, let's say that's the requirement. So we have a Lambda function and this is in a private subnet, and this actually doesn't have access to internet as well. There's no any route out to internet gateway. So how are we going to invoke this one? So for that reason, we are going to use a private link. So with private link, we can invoke AWS services privately, and to create the private link, I'm going to create a VPC interface endpoint. So we have a VPC interface endpoint, and AWS Lambda connects to this step function service through this VPC endpoint and invoke it. So let's get started. So the first function that I want to create is this particular internal Lambda function, and then we'll create the step function express flow. And after that, let's create this invoke Lambda and interface endpoint, so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and start. By the way, I'm not going to use any infrastructure as code, so I'll show you in the console, and you can easily do it with CDK or serverless framework or whatever the infrastructure as code tool that you use. So I'll go to Lambda, and then I'm going to create my first function, that is the internal Lambda function. So this is going to be the placeholder or like a sample Lambda. So I just call it internal Lambda function, and then I'll just create it. Okay, so it's created. So in the code section, let's return some response. So I'll remove this part. I'll just say return hello from internal Lambda. That should do. I will just deploy it. So the Lambda is deployed, and now I'm going to go ahead and create the step function. So let's create the step function and hook up this Lambda. Step functions. Get started. Create your own. And so we have the start and here the Lambda function. So I just use this studio and just drag and drop this Lambda, AWS Lambda placeholder, and then I can configure it. So this is the state name, Lambda invoke, that's fine. And now we need to provide that Lambda function name. So I think we call it internal Lambda. This is that Lambda function we just created, internal Lambda function. That should do. Before I create, I'll go to this config and make sure I select express. Of course, you can select the standard one as well, but I wanted to invoke this step function synchronously and get the results. So I will use express type for that. So this express step function can be invoked synchronously. That's it. So that's the only change I do. And then I'm going to go ahead and create it. So provide the permissions so that step function can invoke that Lambda, CloudWatch, and connect to AWS X-Ray as well. That's all good, and I'll just confirm it. Okay, so it's successfully created. So this is my step function, and let's start a execution. So I'm going to start execution. So let's see, I'm going to invoke it synchronously. Okay, so it succeeded. I'll go to this input output section. So this is my Lambda, and the input is nothing, we are not passing anything, but the output hello from internal Lambda. So this is the response that we return from this Lambda. So our step function can be invoked through this step function studio. So it's all good. So it's working. Now we need to invoke it through this Lambda, but this Lambda is in a private subnet. So how are we going to do this? So let's first go ahead and create this Lambda and put this into a private subnet. So I go back to AWS Lambda, and then I'm going to go ahead and create a function, and this time let's call it invoke Lambda function. Now here I will expand these advanced settings, and I want to include it in a VPC. So I'll select this enable VPC, and I will select one of my VPCs that I have in this account. So this particular VPC, it has 2 private subnets and 2 public subnets. So if I expand expand this subnet section, I see, this is the public one and this is the other public one. These are the 2 private ones. So I'll select 2 private subnets. So my Lambda function is connected to these private subnets. And then I also have to set up a security group for this Lambda function, since this is in the VPC. So let's go ahead and create a security group. So I will just duplicate this tab, and then I will search for VPC. And on the left side section, I should see security group, I believe. Where is it? Yeah, security groups. Here we go. So I'll select this one. So the security group that I'm going to assign is the Lambda security group. So I'll give it a name, internal Lambda security group. And the VPC that I'm going to attach is the VPC that I use for this demo, that is this one. And let's not add any inbound or outbound rules just yet. I'll remove both inbound and outbound rules. There's nothing in it, and just create the security group. You have to provide a description, otherwise you can't create it. Yep, all good. And I create the security group. Okay, so it's created, and let's go back to our previous tab, and we can do a little refresh here. Then I can search for it. Yeah, this is the internal Lambda security group. I just search with its name. Okay, all good. So there's no inbound, no outbound. And I'm gonna go ahead and create this function. So this will take a little bit time, because the network configuration needs to be done. Oh, now we get an error. The execution role does not have a permission to call create network on EC2. Okay, so that's reason is we have to add some permission to this IAM role, because this Lambda needs to be inside this particular VPC. So we need to provide some permission. So this is that IAM role that is going to create. So let me select that one. So here in this IAM role, we need to provide VPC execution policies. By the way, if you see that error, just click create function again. So it will automatically create it, because when we look at it, as you can see, the VPC execution role is already added to it. So that's fine. Like, you just click create again. So that will create the function. So that's what I just did. Okay, so while it is being created, I will add the code to execute the step function here. So let me replace this code. I will also provide this as a code snippet under this video. And so here what we essentially do is we are requiring AWS SDK step function, and from step function we have a step function client and start sync execution command. Since we are using Express step function workflow, I can use this sync execution, otherwise it's start execution command. Okay, so I'm getting that AWS region, and what I need to provide is the state machine ARN, step function ARN. So I'm gonna add that in an environment variable. So let me just copy this name, and I will go to this configuration. Okay, and then go to environment variable, no in environment variable, add an environment variable step function ARN. So let's go to our step function. This is our step function, and in our step function we can copy the ARN. So this is the step function ARN. So I go back here and then add it here. So that is the ARN of the step function, and also I need the region. So that is AWS region, and the region that I'm in is West 1. Okay, that should do, and I save this configuration. Okay, region you can't edit, it's already available, so let me remove it and then I save it again. Okay, so we don't need to add that region, it's already available, so it's all good. So let me go to the code again. Let me see if okay, it's all good. So I have this region, state machine ARN, and then I'm going to create a client, step function client, passing the region. And so this is my handler function. In this handler function, I'm creating a parameter object. So here I'm passed the state machine ARN, and then the input object. So whatever the input that I want to pass to the step function in the first step. So here I just pass hello. I mean, it's not going to do anything. And then this is where I start execution command. And so I have this command. So I'm using sync execution, which I got it from up here. So I want to execute it synchronously. So I can like wait for the result. So this is where I issue that command, client.send the command, and I'll be getting the result from there. And if there are any errors, it'll land in the catch block. It'll throw an error. Otherwise, it'll return a success code with the success message. That should do. Okay, let me deploy it. Okay, so the function is deployed. Now we can actually go ahead and test it. So what we have right now, we have the step function created. We have this internal Lambda function, everything is all good, and we tested it's working fine. And we create the Lambda function, the invoke Lambda function, put it within the private subnet, but we haven't yet configured any VPC endpoint. So, but let's test if we are able to invoke this step function without a VPC endpoint. All right. So let's do this. So I'll go ahead and try to test this Lambda. So this is my invoke Lambda. So I'll click test here. Test event is fine, and then click save. And then now I test it. Okay, so I got timed out. So the default timeout setting, as you can see, if you go to general configuration, is 3 seconds for a Lambda. Maybe I can increase it just a little bit. Let's say 10 seconds and save it. Okay, so I increase the timeout, and if I test it again, so it will time out after 10 seconds. So our Lambda function is unable to connect to the step function. So that's what we are going to set up right now. So we are going to bridge that network gap. So it's timing out right now. Now we need to create this VPC endpoint, this one. So let's come here, And then I'll go to VPC and open it in a new tab. And I'll go ahead and select endpoint from left side. So this is that endpoint. And I don't have any endpoints created. So we are going to create an endpoint. And let's call it step function express endpoint. Okay. And AWS services. So I want to connect to AWS service. And you can search for states. So this is the name for step function endpoints. So there are two endpoints, like you see, com.aws, Amazon AWS, US West 1 states, and the same part, but at the end, the suffix is sync dash states. So if you're using synchronous, if you're using express step function, use this. If you're using a standard step function, use this one. So since I'm using express one, I will select this. Okay, so it's all good. I'll make sure I'll put this endpoint in the correct VPC. That is this VPC where my Lambda function is in right now. So I select that. And then I need to select the subnet as well. So my Lambda function, let me show you, this Lambda function is in a private subnet. So let's select both the private subnet that we configured for this Lambda. So there will be VPC endpoint added to these subnets. Okay, so I will select the private one. So this is the first private subnet and the other private. Look, see, it's a private. Okay, so all good. All right, so now I need to set up a security group for my VPC endpoint. With this VPC endpoint, we can configure a security group. So here we need to create a security group. So this security group is attached to this VPC endpoint, because for VPC endpoint, we can attach a security group. So let's call it VPC endpoint SG. Okay, so this is that security group. Let me add a color here. Good. So this is the security group for the VPC endpoint. And we also have created another security group for our Lambda. So let's create this one. We haven't yet created it. So I will go to security group. So here you can go to VPC security groups again and create a new security group. That is VPC endpoint security group, VPC endpoint security group, and I'm attaching to the same VPC. So let's not add any inbound, outbound yet, right? And then I'll just create the security group. Okay, so it's created. So here, back in my create VPC endpoint window, so I can search for that security group. Before that, I need to refresh it here. There you go, 9th one. So this is that security group, VPC endpoint security group. So I add it, and then I'm going to go ahead and create the endpoint. So we have created the security group, but we haven't yet added any inbound, outbound rules for neither of these security group, but we created a VPC endpoint. So let's try again. Now that we have VPC endpoint, is it able to invoke it? So I'll go ahead and before that, I need to wait until this is created. Let me see if my VPC endpoint is created. It's still pending, so you have to wait. All right, so the status is now available. So let's go back to our invoke Lambda and now try to test it again. So I'll go ahead and click test again. So let's see. Is it going to time out again? Yep, it got timed out again. So although we have a VPC endpoint, it's unable to communicate to the step function service. Why? Because we haven't configured the inbound, outbound rule for these two security groups. So our Lambda is going to connect to the VPC endpoint. So we should have an outbound rule pointing to the VPC endpoint, and the VPC endpoint should also allow that inbound request from the invoke Lambda. So how do we do that? So in order to set up this flow, we can use security group references. So this is my internal Lambda security group. I go there and I'm going to create an outbound rule. So I'll click edit outbound rule and add a rule, and I'll say like all traffic allow to our VPC endpoint security group. So this Lambda can send any traffic to our VPC endpoint security group. Save that rule. But sending is just not enough. We have to make sure that our VPC endpoint security group is also allowing the inbound traffic from that particular Lambda function. So here I will go to inbound. So I'm right now on VPC endpoint security group and edit inbound. Adding a rule, I'm allowing all traffic from this security group, which is our internal Lambda security group. So our Lambda function has this internal Lambda security group attached. So whatever the traffic is being sent to this VPC endpoint is allowed. So that should do. So those two are now configured. So security groups are also configured. So we should be essentially be able to invoke this step function. So let's check that. Go ahead and click test again. There you go. Now the execution is succeeded. Now my Lambda function, look. So here it says this particular Lambda function, this invoke Lambda function is not authorized to perform start sync execution on this resource, like on my step function. Because I have a IAM role attached to this Lambda function, it says what I can do, like what this Lambda is capable of executing. So we need to add a permission to this IAM role attached to this invoke Lambda such that it can invoke a step function. So right now, if I go to the configuration, go to the permissions, I have this IAM role created. This role does not include any permission to invoke a step function. Right now, it has this VPC access and some basic access like to logging and login to CloudWatch and so on. So I'm going to add permission. I click attach policy. Let's add step function full access, but ideally you should trim it down, like have more granular access to your step function only. But let's add this AWS step function full access. Add that permission. All right, so it is added. So if I go ahead and test my invoke step function Lambda again, this time I should not see the error. So let's see. I will test again. There you go, it succeeded. Oh. Let's do a small change in this Lambda and then deploy it, just to make sure that it picks up the correct permission from the IAM role. Let's test it again. Look at this. Now it is succeeded. So I got the 200 status code and the message success. So step function is successfully invoked. So look, the final output is also written hello from internal Lambda. So that is exactly the output that we saw when we execute it manually. Now if I refresh it, I should see that new execution. There you go, the succeeded. If I go into it, hello from internal Lambda, and that is what we receive. Hello from internal Lambda. Okay, so our setup is complete. So we were able to invoke a step function privately from a Lambda function. All right, so this is what I want to show you guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll see you in another video. Thanks.